Wendy Lee really nails it in this conversation she has with Sally next. We're talking a lot about here at the summit about challenges and issues we have, about hopes and dreams, and kind of speculating on what's next. What can we do for young children? What can we do going forward? Well, Wendy brings it in this next piece that you're about to watch. She comes in, first of all, she talks about, the New Zealand response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And she makes, certainly me as an American sitting here, and I think a lot of you watching this of any other country, New Zealand really handled their response. They really did it. And just even listening to her describe what they did gives me a great sense of comfort, knowing that it is possible. But the other piece about it is it makes me feel a little envious. And it is amazing. You could hear a sense of pride in her voice about the way her nation handled it. And I think that's something that, maybe all of us don't feel every day about our elected leaders. The other thing, though, that you're going to love about this is that Wendy is offering us a look at what a future could look like. I have long been an admirer of the New Zealand early childhood education curriculum, the Te Whariki, which is truly a bicultural document. And it is such a beautiful statement of love and respect for young children. It's the kind of thing I wish that everyone around the world could do. I have, and it's a document I think that's unique to New Zealand in some ways, but also but the approach to it and the document itself is something that every one of us could adopt, because it really does speak to the needs for children, the importance of treating children like full citizens, the needs for educators and the respect that educators deserve. And it also has an incredible inclusion of parents and their individual cultures in what they do. And then Wendy talks about something that I know is near and dear to her heart, her process of documentation, the documentation that 97% of New Zealand educators use, which are called learning stories. And I have known about learning stories for a while, but this was just really an eye-opener about how this isn't just a process of documenting children's learning, but it really is a way of being with children that I think you will find inspiring beyond measure. So I just want to thank Wendy for taking the time to be part of this summit, because this is really something I hope every single one of us watch and takes to heart. So have fun and learn a lot.
Hey, welcome back to the Play First Summit. And I am so excited to introduce you to Wendy, who is the director of the Educational Leadership Project, a professional learning provider for early childhood sector in New Zealand. And Wendy has been involved, I love this, in early childhood education for over 45 years as a teacher, tutor, lecturer, manager, professional development facilitator, and researcher. So really a diverse background. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Oh,
wonderful.
Thank you. Looking forward to joining the conversation.
Yeah, so exciting.
So just starting in terms of sharing the documentation, this leading by heart and soul, I think, is at the heart of what I want to say today, particularly around COVID, but beyond COVID. It's a philosophical view of documentation and its ability to share, connect and reflect, which has been exemplified during this period in New Zealand. So here we are, a long way from the rest of the world, and that has proven to be actually to our advantage, in fact, particularly in light of the pandemic. So I want to introduce myself really in the way to bring you back into my country, New Zealand, Aotearoa, because one of the things about being in New Zealand, it's a bicultural nation, Māori and non-Māori, Pākehā as we refer to them, to the group, our own group that is. Māori have brought to us a new perspective on things like introductions. It is not important what we've done, but rather where do we come from? Who are we? Because the essence of what Māori are doing is making connections and remembering the power of relationships. So I'm going to just give you a little introduction, as I would in this country, in New Zealand, to me and where I come from and my family. So, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, a greeting. Ko Bluff Hill Te Monga. This is the mountain, a small mountain, under which I was born. Ko Hawke Bay Te Awa. This is the sea near where I was born. Ko Wendy Lee Taku Ingoa, my name. Ko John Lee, Raua, ko Nancy Small, o ku mātua. These are my parents, and this is me as a preschooler, a young child. Ko David Rowe, Rangatira Tāne, my husband. Ko Timothy, Raua, ko Patrick, o ku Tamaiti. These are my children. Ko Miller, Raua, ko Isla, o ku Mokapuna. These are my grandchildren, or our grandchildren, I should say. No Kirikiri Roa. This is the place I come from, Hamilton in New Zealand. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So actually, at lockdown, this is where I was off to. And I had been working in the South Island and right down across the South Island, and we had made a decision to walk the Milford Track, which is one of our great national walks, a 5-day walk. And then as we were about to embark on this walk, the message came from the Prime Minister that lockdown was imminent and that we would all have to return home with great urgency. I think in New Zealand, we've been incredibly lucky because Jacinda Ardern as a Prime Minister had already shown under crisis with the Christchurch terrorist bombing how extraordinary she was in a crisis. And this was to be repeated with the pandemic. Absolutely consistent messages to the nation that we were a team of 5 million and we needed to stick together, work together on this big task of fighting COVID-19. Overall message, be kind. This was the first clear message that, you know, it was going to be challenging, but that we all needed to be kind to each other. But we headed into lockdown. Now, for many people, it was pretty scary. I mean, these were the sorts of images, get home, lockdown. And fortunately, again, a Māori perspective came into view. They wouldn't refer to this, Māori wouldn't refer to lockdown as lockdown, they would refer to it as a rāhui. And really by bringing this view into visibility, Rose Pere, who's a fabulous person and a fabulous leader in New Zealand, talked about this, about the reframing, that it is a rāhui, it's a ban or a temporary, very temporary restriction. And it's not just about ourselves, it's about being kaitiaki, you know, guardians of Papatuanuku, our earth, but also to protect ourselves and each other, and to uphold the spirit of oneness. So I think that this shifted for a lot of people, starting to view it, particularly early childhood teachers, that to think of it in terms of rāhui, to not sensationalize, but to see it for what it was. So be kind, stay home, save lives, and notice the small joys. You know, these were the messages, prepare more but worry less. And always remember, we're going to get past this. It's a temporary state. And we were all, there was this notion that you would go to your bubble. And everyone had their own bubble. And once you made a decision on your bubble, I mean, some people had big bubbles. Like some people had very big bubbles. You know, in one house, there would be, maybe 2 or 3 families. And other people had very small bubbles, right down to, of course, one person in a bubble. But once you'd made your decision on your bubble, you were there for lockdown. And those were the decisions that were made. So this idea of the bubble was constantly talked about. And actually, people deeply respected this. You know, this is my bubble for the period of lockdown. Now, I'm going to leave that there and come back to some of the ideas around what we did. during COVID, but perhaps one of the most important foundations, or if not the most important foundation in New Zealand early childhood education, is our curriculum, Te Whāriki. And I want to really start from the beginning, just for those of you who haven't had any involvement or engagement with our curriculum. These people on the screen at the moment are the original writers. Helen May and Margaret Carr were originally appointed by government, and testament to both of them, they immediately brought Tili and Tamati Redi from the Kohanga Reo movement, the Māori language early childhood education movement, straight into the writing team. Now, this had the most powerful impact on the development of Te Whāriki, because Tili and Tamati brought with them the most fabulous gift, the gift of mana, the gift of a framework around Te Whāriki that was truly sociocultural. You know, the metaphors that stuck, and the principles and strands, you know, the principles that Tili and Tamati brought, whakahaere, kaupapa whakahaere, the principles were so universal for all of us: empowerment, holistic development, reciprocal relationships, family and community. And these held the whole document, and beyond those principles were held the notion of the strands, whakahere. Now, the strands: belonging, well-being, contribution, communication, exploration. So, I mean, we all so connected and had resonance with these ideas right from the very beginning. So I consider the gift, because it wasn't just the gift of those principles and strands, it was the gift of the metaphor of Te Whāriki. Te Whāriki in English is a mat, a woven mat, somewhere for all of us to stand, and each community weaving their own pattern. So it's not some sort of top-down community curriculum, it's a curriculum that comes from the foundation. So this process of the development of Te Whāriki was extraordinary. I think anyone who's been involved in any form of curriculum development will look back at New Zealand's commitment. It was from the beginning to the end something like 5 years, because it was truly consultative. There was the draft that was first put together was constantly in consultation. There were groups set up across the nation. Every interest group, whether you were home-based or whether you were a Kohanga or a Pacific Island Nest or a Montessori or a Rudolf Steiner or a whoever, everyone was involved in this consultation. And the writers group wrote papers that sent these out to the community, and then we responded. And there was a lot of challenge. I mean, just the challenge from moving away from the notion of a preschooler to an early childhood child, a preschooler in preparation for school. No, an early childhood child on the journey of life and living and learning. You know, and these were fabulous debates that the community engaged with. And so when the final document came out in 1996, I can remember opening it up in the sense of, holding it to my heart and thinking, this is us. This is who we are. And it was, that very first day, I was working with a group of senior citizens on an arts project at a museum, and I took the document along and I said, the celebration Te Whāriki has born. It's just such an extraordinary thing. And as they looked at the document, they all said, oh my goodness, this could be ours. All of these principles, all of these strands matter to us. And, you know, that said everything actually about this document. So these phases have been very, very interesting. And, you know, this was the first socio-cultural curriculum in the world. And it changed, it moved away from those traditional frames of reading, writing, arithmetic, you know, whatever. But it doesn't mean these aren't in Te Whāriki, they're just woven into the document rather than the main frame. The main frame is belonging, well-being, contribution, communication, exploration, and all of sitting, and filtered through all those powerful principles universal to all mankind, or humankind, I should say. Now, I think one of the really interesting things that happened in the first instance, the government recognized that actually here we are with this new and rather fabulous early childhood curriculum. And if we don't revisit the notion of what assessment looks like, we are going to find ourselves with old assessment practices driving this curriculum, and we will not get the benefit of the curriculum. So they put forward a contract to look at how might assessment look. And Margaret Carr won that contract, and I was involved at that time as a teacher in the development of the assessment practice. And it was such an exciting time. And Margaret she said to us, look, go out and write stories, just write narrative, watch the children and write. And as we wrote, we would hand over our documentation to Margaret. And one day she came back to us and she said, I know what I'm reading. I'm reading learning stories. It was her inspiration. And it was such a beautiful moment of this recognition that here we were involved in developing something, ensuring it was whatever we wrote took cognizance of those principles. That first principle, empowerment, was so important because it actually had shifted, Te Whāriki had shifted our image of the child, that it was no more just about, the deficit child or the needy child or the gaps. It was about the strengths. It was about recognizing every child as capable and competent and coming from this very different position. It was an extraordinary change at that time, and it was incredibly disruptive to past views. And I think that I can't remember, I'm just thinking of the timeline. After that was developed and we started to engage the wider community in the notion of what it is to write and assess early childhood education, the government set up a big exemplar project. Actually, at the time, it was a shift from one government to another. A more conservative government wanted national standards, and this was about for the primary sector. And clearly, we didn't want anything to do with that.
Right.
And
no.
There was a whole lot of money about to go into these national standards, and then there was a change in government, and the new government said, no, we don't want national standards. We want you to look more closely at assessment. And they set up this using the resources from the national standards to allow teachers to explore assessment across the nation in primary schools. And initially they forgot us, and then of course suddenly realized, early childhood's not here, and drew us in and invited Margaret Carr and myself to lead a pilot around the development of assessment in New Zealand in early childhood education. And this started as a pilot and turned into a 9-year project.
Wow.
And in the process, it was really about an ongoing conversation with teachers around assessment, about reflection and thinking and reviewing and considering various aspects of assessment. It was a very exciting project and resulted in what you can see here is 20 small books around assessment ideas. Not to say that there has never been in New Zealand a time when people have said, you have to do learning stories. It is entirely a professional decision, professional autonomy to decide what you want to do. Now, at one stage, this research hasn't been done recently, but some time ago when the research was done, 97% of teachers in New Zealand were writing learning stories of their own volition, because learning stories actually did enable us to revisit, reflect, reimagine, and reconstruct assessment as we know it. And actually they were accessible to children, they were accessible to families, and they were meaningful to teaching communities. So it has been a very exciting journey, and has both Te Whāriki and learning stories, I believe, have enormously shaped our vision of the child today. Learning is much more than skills testing and compliance. It's much more deeper. And actually, it should be, as Michael Fullan says, irresistibly engaging. Because all of us know when children are truly engaged, motivation is high, commitment to learning through determination and focus and curious exploration is what we want to see and offer children. So it's been, I think, a wonderful journey. Now, the government decided this was the last government, that they wanted a review. And this has always been of deep concern to the early childhood community, because Te Whāriki has held the test of time remarkably. When you think about when it was first, it's now nearly, I think, 27 years ago since that beginning process. More like 24 years since the inception of the actual document. And they said, oh no, we're going to do a 5-week review of Te Whāriki and review and rewrite. So there was quite a lot of activity in the early childhood community. And this writing team had a very big job. Now, I believe there were some very influential people on this team, Leslie Ramaka and Brenda Suter, who brought a stronger bicultural feel, because some of that was lost between the draft and the final document. So the process, the updating process, basically, actually, there were some very fabulous things that happened. Before Te Whāriki, the Māori version of Te Whāriki, which is it's not a translation, it's a standalone document, sat inside the whole document. And the English version, which is a bicultural document, was like the bulk of the document. So in the rewrite, it's a flip document. So when you open it on one side, it's the English document, which is one description of curriculum. And then on the other side is the Kohanga Reo movement document, entirely in Māori. It's not a translation. Actually, it's a very much more deeper, more spiritual document coming from a Māori perspective. And these two documents provide two different worldviews. And those who are lucky enough to speak to their Māori can obviously use both documents. So what changed in the update was obviously the context language. And I think one of the lovely things that happened was there's a lot more Māori in the English version, and it's not translated. There is a glossary, but it's not translated, because New Zealand's language is changing as more and more Māori is embedded in the English language. There's definitely a stronger bicultural framing with a focus on language, culture, and identity, and on inclusion, and utter recognition that every single teacher in our country is actually operating a bicultural document, not an English document, a bicultural document. And there are fewer learning outcomes, and there are stronger links to the school curriculum, which is the original school curriculum, which changed after Te Whāriki, is very connected to the early childhood curriculum structurally as well. And there's been a whole lot of development of resources as well. So this national curriculum is focused on and grounded in both the past and the future. The courage to explore new challenges and the learning of new languages and knowledge. And I think it has been a very, very much a step forward. When we think about the central metaphor of Te Whāriki, if we can see the pattern of the child, we can, this is what it's about. It's seeing that every child is an individual, and that we are there and responsible to work with the pattern of each child. So before, Te Whāriki was only seen as the curriculum on which we stand, and now Te Whāriki is also seen as the metaphor of the whāriki of each child. That's definitely a shift from the previous document. And these are the 4 principles that overarch Te Whāriki. Children learn through responsive and reciprocal relationships with people, places, and things. That in terms of empowerment, early childhood curriculum empowers the child to learn and grow, whakamana. And thirdly, holistic development, ko tahitanga. Early childhood curriculum reflects the holistic way children learn and grow. And of course, the last one, family and community, whānau tangata. The wider world of family and community is an integral part of the early childhood curriculum. So I actually, as a teacher, feel that if every person in this country filtered their entire philosophy through these 4 principles, what a difference it makes to the provision, with a true focus on what this might mean in practice in each setting. Obviously, it's going to be different. Every community is different. So then these strands, the strands that fall out of the principles, ngā whenu, and you can see, I'm just going to give you a really quick window into this because it's hard to express the fullness of these strands. But the first strand, well-being, mana atua, in the English version, children understand their own mana, their own sense of themselves, their own power. And actually this is more attuned to the Māori version. Children, I always take it on because I just think it's such a beautiful statement that it's deserving of every child.
Absolutely.
That children understand their own mana atutanga, uniqueness and spiritual connectedness. And so that is the version inside the kohanga reo movement. And then the English version says well-being, children have a sense of well-being and resilience. So the second one, belonging, mana whenua, is, and taking that first one, mana whenua, children's relationship to papa tuanuku is based on whakapapa, respect and aroha. So this whakapapa is my genealogy, is my past, those who have gone before, respect and obviously love. And in the English version, belonging, children know they belong and have a sense of connection to others and to the environment. The third strand is contribution, mana tangata. Children have a strong sense of themselves as a link between past, present and future. And Māori have a very different view of time, all in this moment. It's circular rather than linear. And the English version says contribution, children learn with and alongside others. So communication, mana reo, through te reo Māori, children's identity, belonging and well-being are enhanced. And obviously in New Zealand, there's been a huge renaissance of te reo Māori from a pretty dark past of colonisation to a strengthening and development. And now all teachers in this country have a responsibility for the development of te reo Māori and to support taha Māori in every way they possibly can for every New Zealander. And for the English document, children are strong and effective communicators. And the final strand is mana Aotearoa. Now, children see themselves as explorers, able to connect with and care for their own and the wider worlds. And in the English version, children are critical thinkers, problem solvers, and explorers. So, it's a tiny window into significant strands of Te Whāriki, but it will give you a sense and probably also a recognition of why people are so committed to the ideas that Māori have gifted to us and the depth that sits inside that document that will bring such a richness to the learning environment and the community.
It's stunning.
Yeah. So I think that, from early childhood centered to home, we have been nurturing learning stories now for more than 2 decades. And they have been through the most extraordinary process. It's a dynamic process, and we have seen such a lovely development. You can even just see from this photo, this is the baby brought home her portfolio, and the schoolboy and the older sister rushed to get their portfolios. And no one can tell me that that baby is not interested in that portfolio with her photographs.
Oh my word,
And
absolutely.
but you can see the format has changed. That first one on the left with the older boy was very much a sort of a format. And then, of course, as we grew with the digitization and the use of photography and computer graphics, you see the movement to a very interesting. I think the thing is teachers recognize that actually this document, this document about my learning, is actually the child's first literacy artifact, and we now have many examples of children holding on to them and adding to them when they get to school, but also returning. More recently, one of the teachers was invited to a very large Pacifica 21st, 500 plus guests. And when she arrived at this celebration of this child she'd taught at kindergarten, that's why she was invited. What was the key document that was used and read at this 21st? Nothing less than her portfolio when she was at kindergarten
Wow.
as a 3 and 4-year-old. And we have seen them used in so many contexts, and I do believe it's because they recognize the power of the teacher's subjectivity and the personal relationship, and they are so there's something so strongly connecting because of the authenticity and the storying that talks about this child's learning life as they grow and develop. So learning stories, have many roles. They make learning visible, utterly critical. This is a learning environment, and the different parts of the learning story are very important. They strengthen relationships. They build the identity of the learner. They engage the family. They support transitions. They evolve into planning stories, and they contribute to accountability. But I know in those very early days, if you hold a deficit view, it colors the way you operate as a teacher. And pre-Te Whāriki, often teachers at the end of the day, were very likely to enter a space of going to the parent and talking about maybe a concern that something that's happened to that day that they're worried about. And when they started writing learning stories, we said to them, the first thing you need to do is share those stories, read them to the parent, see what they think. And they would rush toward the parent, and the parent would go, oh, because in the past, when the teacher rushed toward you at the end of a session, it was to tell you something that your child had done that was deeply concerning. And they'd go, oh, no. And then they'd go, oh, no, I've got something I want to share with you, something I've just written, a learning story. It's, my first learning story for your child, and I'm very excited about it. And as they read that story to the parent, often the teachers felt quite tearful, and the parents were too, because in that moment of reading the story, the parent utterly knew that this teacher cared deeply about their child because of what they were writing.
Oh.
And I think those are the shifts that really change the motivation of teachers around documenting learning in this way. So learning stories, not a format, a philosophy, which actually, it's a philosophy that's imbued in Te Whāriki and a way of viewing the world, actually. Assessment for all children will be consistent with the principles of Te Whāriki, and that was one of the mantras and the most important things that really got us onto this very powerful pathway. And inside this Te Whāriki, Margaret Carr and Helen May and a group of teachers all talked about these ideas around developing questions. And these particular questions, I think, were really powerful for children to think about these questions coming from children, phrased from a child's perspective, and also touching the hearts of teachers to really question what matters. So when this child looks up at you and says, do you know me? Can I trust you? Do you hear me? Is this place fair for me? Do you let me fly? And each one of these questions are directly linked to one of the strands of Te Whāriki. And I think this is because they connect so powerfully on such a strong emotional level, you know, and it makes teachers think so deeply about this connection to wise practice and what it means for the child and what it means for this child's family. And, you know, this relational action, this philosophy in practice. So, you know, Te Whāriki brought this cumulative wisdom to our early childhood community. And, you know, we are very grateful
it's amazing
for the contribution of Māori to this document. So, you know, Rita Walker, another Māori academic, I mean, the writing, I think, again, resonance with Te Whāriki, but resonance with our view of teaching and learning. Adults working with children must establish meaningful and intimate relationships, encouraging and supporting them in a way that is unhurried, peaceful and tranquil, by interacting in a manner that motivates and ignites the passion to learn. So fabulous. So, you know, the 4 principles, then of course this notion of thinking about assessment as noticing, recognizing, responding, recording, revisiting, and reflecting. And this was first developed, actually the first 3, noticing, recognizing, responding, came out of a secondary school science curriculum that we were exploring when we were doing Keitua o Te Pai. Margaret and I, the project I talked about, the development of the early childhood exemplars, as we, you know, explored the notion of assessment. And we were very much thinking about Mary Jane Drummond, who was at Cambridge University, and thinking about the ways in which in our everyday practice, children, families, teachers and others observe children's learning, notice, strive to understand it, recognize it, and then put our understanding to good use. And I think one of the things that this noticing, recognizing and responding filter did was, because we'd say to teachers, just watch. And if something excites you and you recognize it as powerful for that child, you know, then respond. So it shifted the whole planning notion. Instead of adults doing these great planning events and then sort of dumping it, you know, like virtually hijacking the whole program and running it, rather than listening to children's voices, by stopping, slowing down and noticing, teachers said, oh my goodness, I'm back teaching the reason I came here. I'm back into this intuitive space. I'm back here listening to the voice of the child and responding to what they want to do. And actually, you know, each day became exciting because actually they were now deeply engaged in these relationships. It was not, they were not in surveillance mode. They were not observing from afar. They were closely engaging, noticing and recognizing the important moments. So that, like, it did, I think that one of the things I remember in those early days when we had these national early childhood professional development focused around assessment, we had, it's rather extraordinary, but, you know, we're talking about hundreds of teachers on a project across the nation doing year-long professional development, and 100% of them at the end of the year saying learning stories has changed the way I teach.
Wow.
Yeah, that's huge. It was extraordinary to have that voice. So, I mean, extraordinarily represented, actually. So these learning stories, the noticing is obviously the story in the photos. The recognizing is utterly critical. The analysis, I mean, we are interested in learning. We are interested in building that child's identity as a learner. So what learning do I think is happening here? Or what did I learn about this child today? Or the teacher's reflection on learning. So this is the second part. And the third part is the responding. Actually, this is the planning. What will we do as a community, not just me, what will we do as a community to strengthen, support, and extend this learning? To have those conversations. And actually it begins to shift the whole pedagogical place of this environment. So what makes a good story? An interesting title, offers ideas to grow learning, easy to connect with, informative, humorous, makes learning visible, tracks learning, written often directly to the child, provokes an emotional response, and develops relationships. These are some of the ideas around the sort of notion of story and the power of story. And I'm going to share this story. It's a little story called Dennis's Wonderful Jump. Quite a simple story, and one written by Julie, who you'll meet a wee bit later. So in talking about the story, we would be thinking about the learner. Who is the child? And who is this child as a learner? And what do we know about their dispositions, their courage and curiosity, their trust and playfulness, perseverance, confidence and responsibility, and keeping those big 21st century learning dispositions in the picture, but also aware of the child's interest or passion and all of the other things that might flow from this, but always trying to keep a balance and to keep the big picture of learning in perspective. So the what of learning and how is this child learning? So what does this learning story, when I read it, just think about what does this learning story tell you about the educator's practice or the teacher's practice? Dear Dennis, I put the plank up high and children started to walk along and jump off. This is a sort of an extension of the springboard challenge I set up the other day. I asked you if you would like a turn. You shook your head and looked at me as though you thought I might be a wee bit crazy. Maybe you might like to try later, I suggested. You walked away to play somewhere else. Then a little while later, you came back. Your curiosity was getting the better of you. I think I could hold your hand, I said. You agreed, and so it was. You climbed up onto the plank and I held your hand and then you jumped. Whee! You asked me to hold your hand one more time and then you didn't need me anymore. Oh boy, Dennis, you quickly mastered this plank walking and jumping challenge, and soon you were not only walking across the plank, you were running. And you didn't just jump off, you flew off, launching yourself into the air so high that when you landed, you'd reached the very end of the mat. Wow, wow, wow. Moments like these are what I live for, Dennis. To see you develop your confidence from not wanting to try to becoming involved with support to launching yourself like a supernova. This is the joy of being a teacher, to be able to support you and other children to grow and realize your amazing potential. When you next face something you're not sure of, remember how when you give things a go and do some practice, you can fly. Now, remembering this child actually is a new immigrant to New Zealand and has come from a very different learning environment. And I think, when the parents entered this setting, they would have thought, oh, they just play here. This is a wild environment and could be seen as chaotic by some, rather than a lively, engaged learning environment. If you've not seen this, if your environments that you've experienced both as a learner and as a family are very, very different, then it's, important that the teacher transports and translates this information into the hearts and minds of this family so they can begin to see another view of learning. And this is what Julie does when she writes about the learning. So what learning do I think is happening here? Life is full of so many exciting learning adventures. This week it was mastering the jump challenge, and in the future it might be struggling with a maths problem or tackling a tricky reading challenge. It's all the same principle. Be courageous, give things a go and try, and your efforts are bound to be rewarded with success. Thank you, Dennis. Love, Julie. You see, I think that's a fabulous connection that this teacher is making into the hearts and minds of this family about this ordinary event. In some places, it's just a jump. Actually, for him in this moment, it was extraordinary. And it was an important and powerful learning opportunity for him that will stretch him into other places. So if you looked at this story through the lens of Dennis, if I show my family and friends, will they understand the amazing things I can do? Can I see myself? Is it interesting? Does the teacher see me as capable and competent? So I think learning stories is finding out whether it is spreading out its roots into the deepest parts of your heart. And each of us has to search for the reason that bids us to write stories and to teach. And I think that this is, you know, once it captures you, you can't stop. It's just the process that is, you know, assessment documentation, we would say, you know, it's so important that if you don't use it, I mean, we used to do documentation, assessment, running records, you know, like checklists. I could go on and on, these endless testing type assessment documents, and actually we'd put them in folders and put them in the office. Thank goodness, actually, no one really saw them beyond the teachers, and that's something we're grateful as we look back and reflect on that past, because we did what we believed was the best at the time. We had a deficit view, we had a gaps view, we were trying to fill it. And now we say to teachers, look, if you don't use your documentation every day, life's too precious, time's too precious. You use it or lose it. And if it's worth using and it engages the children and the family, then it's worth doing. Because actually the thing that's happening now is our documentation is providing this powerful foundation for actually everything that we do. So this constant revisiting of as soon as I go into a centre, children want to show me their portfolios and to talk about what's in their portfolios. It's the most fabulous connector. I can have know nothing about these children. It was a super story early on when an ERO, this is an accountability audit by government, came to the centre, and he was in his suit and he walked in, and one of the children said, I'll show you the portfolios. And he sat down with this child, and the child started showing him the portfolio, and he was very compliant and quite interested, obviously, because his role was to audit the practice and what was happening in the early childhood centre. Anyway, so the child is talking about each story, and it wasn't until the fifth story that he realized this wasn't this child's portfolio. He was actually sharing another child's portfolio.
Oh, wow.
So this is the sort of notion of in a centre where stories are shared, because they can't not be shared, because they actually, each story shows the capability and competence of each child and actually gives other children other possibilities of things they might do. So it's strengthening the community in so many ways. So we say to teachers, I mean, I've said this for a long time, and I don't mean necessarily, people go find the magic. Oh, you're just tipping off the edge. No, find the magic. Each of us in our own way has magical things. This is a sort of the wow moment, and it comes in various forms. And at the heart is the strength-based approach. Slow down the space, slow down the pace. Listen more, and be present. And then you can, in that moment of seeing something that excites you, can write with wonder, joy, and energy, and share that with the child and with the family. They know when what you write is deeply connected to their child, because of the perspective that you bring. So learning stories, more than just a great story, articulate, purposeful, have validity, based around current research and wise teaching practice. So they're an accurate account of learning and teaching that happens in early childhood centres. A recognition that none of us are objective. Already well researched, none of us are capable of full objectivity, because we bring our own lens. Each of us has had a different experience in life and bring different values and views of the world. But the important thing is to recognize is your subjectivity is valued is important. And actually, it's these multiple voices of teachers and parents and siblings who bring their views into learning stories. And there are teachers writing learning stories, there are parents writing learning stories, there are grandparents writing learning stories, there are siblings writing learning stories. You know, these multiple voices bring a more holistic view of the child. So teachers listen deeply to children. As you know, Stephen Covey said, listen first to understand rather than to be understood. I always have believed that has been such a powerful place for people to stand, to stop, whether it's to a parent or whether it's to a community member or to children. Listen first to understand. Write learning stories because you're deeply interested in what is happening. You're curious and engaged. Making the learning visible, making and strengthening connections of children, family, and teachers, writing with joy and enthusiasm, writing from the heart.
And your example was so much that I was like, I almost wanted to cry when you read that story. It was just so beautiful. I mean, it's so deep, just profound.
I wanted to share one more story before I move on, because this is a story of a Māori child. And, you know, it has all the challenges of, for instance, a non-Māori, a Pākehā, as we call it in our country, and a European teacher who actually wants to connect with this family and is navigating her own cultural understanding and or possible lack of understanding, certainly lack of depth, but is learning about things Māori and trying to deepen her understanding. So this learning story is about making connections to the natural world. Pounamu in our country, greenstone, comes from the rivers of our land. It's taonga, it's a treasure that connects people to the land and to their ancestry. It's a very important stone. Making and strengthening connections to children, families, and teachers. So this is the story. And I'm going to share not quite all the story, but basically this is Tyson. And Tyson, a few weeks ago, I clearly remember you vibrantly sharing with me your really special taonga, your greenstone necklace. And over the last 4 weeks, I have had a student called Tukumihia here with us, learning to be a teacher. And when she left us, she gave me a really special taonga, just like yours. Today, I brought my greenstone, my taonga, to show you so we could have meaningful discussions about this gift. You carefully opened the box to my necklace and said, "Can I put it on?" "Yes, you can," I replied. "Your one is not the same as my one. My one is this shape and your one is this shape, but it matches mine." You then continued to say, "My one came from Nanny and Pop, found it from the greenstone. They picked it up and gave it to me, and they put lots of lollies in it, and I eat them in my tummy." And then, as we sat together, you were analysing each of the pounamu, and I asked you, "What does your greenstone mean?" I wondered, Tyson. And you replied, "It means that it is special and that I am special." Now, I'm not sharing this whole story because it's a very long story and has very wonderful analysis, but I have put on the slide where you can see the entire story on a YouTube on learning stories around bicultural development.
Oh, wonderful.
So this is what I'm going to share with you now is actually the response after the story was written. It was obviously sent to the family, and the grandfather responded to the story. And he said, "What a thoughtful account, Karen. Thanks for sharing it with us. The easiest way to explain how Tyson's pounamu came to be is simply to say it chose him. We searched far and wide and examined dozens, possibly hundreds of stones, looking for that special something. Initially without much success, we finally stopped at a little place in Kawakawa, and we looked through a selection of stones, and Nanny said, 'Here he is,' and held up the taonga. There was no need for examination or consultation, as we knew it had found its way home. Look into the taonga and you will see Tyson there. The shape signifies Tyson's creativity, passion, and energy. The marble colouring holds proud his blended Māori, European, and Niuean heritage. His strength and courage, his compassion and empathy are the rigidity and texture of the pounamu. The taonga is special because our moko, our grandson, makes it so. Now, when you've got a response like that, you know.
Yeah. Wow. Beautiful.
And I think, you know, Karen, I mean, inside Karen's learning story was this sort of framing and this sort of wording. And she writes inside the story, Tyson, over time and through meaningful interactions and play, we have come to build a reciprocal, trusting relationship. As a teacher, and this is my bolding, I have to say, as a teacher, I am not the expert. Rather, we are learning beside each other as we share ideas, construct knowledge, and explore our understandings of the world around us in meaningful ways. Sharing our taonga was special to me, Tyson, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to further strengthen our connection. So, you know, for those of you who are interested to go back to the full story that you can see on YouTube and revisit this whole story, I think you'll get a sense of why Karen ended up with that beautiful response from the whānau, from the family. So every day you can make a difference. Learning stories will communicate what you value. I mean, and for every context and every place that will be different. But those are the things that should come strongly through your learning stories.